Welcome to Secret Story. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel. I continue the tale of how I got involved in the amazing exploits of Lupe, my uncle's second wife, when I stayed at their guest house on the Pacific coast of Colombia. That I had traveled there on my first paid photography assignment after graduating from university. I was staying in their remote small town, as my uncle had moved from the UK many years ago and bought a guest house there. My Uncle Jerry was almost 60, and I was stunned on arrival at the guest house to meet his wife Lupe, who was in her mid-30s. On my first full day there, I had caught Lupe with one of the other guests. She had certainly been enjoying herself and had also worked out I had been spying on her. Lupe later explained that my uncle's financial situation was dire and that she had made a financial agreement with the only two other guests. Lupe had then asked if I wanted to make a similar arrangement with her, which I absolutely did. Of course, these arrangements had to be kept secret from my uncle. But then I had spied on one of the guests with a different woman, Izzy. I had spied on them, with their full knowledge and consent. Of course, Lupe and Izzy had organized a rota, with 2-hour sessions twice a day. Of course, when Lupe found out the next day that Izzy she wanted. She had convinced Marcus during his session with Lupe to allow Andre to join them, and I had very much enjoyed spying on her, almost as much as she had enjoyed herself. Lupe and Izzy then finished out the week with other sessions, until they had completed their little rota. The American guys had then left to fly home, surely with big smiles on their faces, and lots of wonderful memories. Life then finally returned to how it had been before the American guys had arrived here, and I was glad. But as Lupe and Izzy had been so busy each day, they had sadly had to delay their commitments elsewhere. Lupe had told Mr. Dubois and Mr. Cohen, the two long-term renters at her Casa Madre guest house, that she had an agreement to twice a week, and would make it up to them the following week. Lupe had obviously told me the truth, that she would be down at Izzy's guest house across town, Casa Rosita. She had told me that both she and Izzy would make it up to me too. Throughout the following week, I saw Lupe heading to, or coming out of, both Mr. Cohen's and Mr. Dubois' rooms on many occasions. She would of course always wait until her husband, my Uncle Jerry, had left for work. In fact, on most days I saw her visit Mr. Cohen's room in the morning and Mr. Dubois' room in the afternoon. She was a very busy lady. However, it left Lupe with no time left over for me. I too had missed out on my 2 sessions with Lupe last week, plus the 2 sessions I would usually get this week. Lupe told me she had asked if Izzy might be able to pop over to Casa Madre, but it seemed that Izzy had the same issue over at Casa Rosita. Izzy was behind on her sessions with her own long-term renters, and so was trying to catch up too. So Lupe had to roll over all my sessions into the week after. It meant 6 times in the same week that I had an incredible time. At the end of the week, I was exhausted, but very, very happy. On the weekend, Uncle Jerry invited me to dinner with himself and Lupe. We sat in their kitchen and enjoyed some good home-cooked food and chatted. Initially, I had felt rather awkward when my uncle would invite me to eat with him and Lupe. Of course, I liked Lupe more than I hated feeling awkward around my uncle. But over time these dinners had become the norm, and I didn't feel so bad now. During our conversation, I mentioned that the shower in my room had developed a fault. The handle to adjust the temperature of the water had become incredibly stiff to turn. My uncle said he would take a look at it sometime. The following week I went off on a trip along the coast to try and catch up on my photography assignment. My boss back in London had emailed me a few days ago, apologizing for not getting back to me about my request to extend my stay here. My original assignment had been for 2 months here, and I was already well over a month into it. I couldn't bear the thought of having to leave the amazing Lupe and Izzy and fly back home in just a few weeks. I had exaggerated to my boss the problems I was having getting around the coastline, to come up with a reason as to why I was behind in the project of photographing all the amazing flora and fauna along the Pacific coastline here, and why I needed to stay on here longer to complete it. Of course, the real reason I had done this was Lupe and Izzy. I wanted to get some great photos this week, to send back to London to impress my boss, hoping it would help him look kindly on my request. My expenses were not very much, so I hoped this would also go in my favor. My boss didn't know it, but he was in fact footing the bill for me to with Lupe. I was paying 750,000 Colombian pesos in rent a month to stay at Casa Madre Guesthouse, which was only £150, or $200. Secretly, I was then also paying a further 750,000 pesos to Lupe for her special weekly services. But when I sent in my expenses to my boss back in London, I stated that my monthly rent was 1.5 million pesos, or pound 300. That I didn't think my boss would have any knowledge of what a room in a guest house on the Pacific coast of Colombia would cost, and they had never queried it. After a few days away catching up with my work, I headed on a ferry boat back to my home base in the town Uncle Jerry had made his home. I arrived at Casa Madre Guesthouse on Thursday evening. As I made my way across the courtyard toward the staircase that led up to the first floor veranda where my room was located, Uncle Jerry appeared from behind his truck. "Ah, there he is," Uncle Jerry said, rather sternly, placing a wrench in the cargo bed of his truck. "I've been waiting to talk to you." "Hi Uncle, what's up?" I replied innocently, but inside was worrying about what he wanted to talk to me about. "Well, while you were away, I've made a rather disturbing discovery," he continued, moving toward the doorway that led into the family home section at the end of the building that he shared with Lupe. I froze. What had he discovered? Had he somehow found out Lupe? Did he want to know if I had known anything about it, or worse still, had he found out about me and Lupe somehow? All these questions raced through my mind. My uncle opened the door and reached inside to grab something, but I couldn't make it out as the sun had set already and it was getting petty dark out here. "I went into your room yesterday to fix your shower, and found this," he said gruffly and threw the item toward me. I caught it, and looked at it for a moment, trying to make out what it was in the dim light. "Well? What do you have to say for yourself?" Uncle Jerry asked harshly. I moved closer to the light coming from the doorway to work out what it was, then realized what it was, and was mortified. It was one of Lupe's shirt, a red one. She must have left it in my bathroom during the last time I was with her. I looked at my uncle in horror. What was he going to do? Scream at me? Hit me? Worse? "I'm waiting for an answer, boy," Uncle Jerry continued, moving toward me. "What's been going on here when I'm away, huh?" My heart was racing. I didn't know how to explain this away. I mumbled, gulping, beginning to panic now. "Well, Uncle." "Stop teasing the boy," I heard from inside the house. I looked up to see Lupe appear, a grin on her face. She moved close to Uncle Jerry, hugging him. "I told your uncle you have a young girlfriend now," Lupe smiled, looking up at her husband. Uncle Jerry's face turned from that stern look to grinning like and began laughing. Of course, he thought it would be funny to make a joke out of it. Lupe explained, looking disapprovingly at her husband. "You should have seen your face." Uncle Jerry laughed unapologetically, pointing at me. "Oh, I see," I managed, trying to smile, and thanking my lucky stars for Lupe's quick thinking. I guessed my uncle had found the shirt and showed it to his wife, who had come up with the story, and that the shirt must be hers. "Kid, I don't care if you want to. You enjoy yourself while you're here. I'm not like your stuck-up parents, you know," my uncle said, still laughing. I nodded, my heart still beating out of my chest. I had come very close to saying something that I shouldn't, to confessing to what had actually been going on. Thank God Lupe came out and interrupted me. "So, what's this girlfriend like?" Uncle Jerry asked, grinning. "Yeri," Lupe scolded. Due to her fairly harsh Colombian accent, Lupe always pronounced Jerry as Yeri. "Well, a love runs in the family, kid. I've told you that before," my uncle said, winking. "Yeri, behave." Lupe scolded her husband as he laughed again. "So, you got yourself a nice young piece of ass, huh kid?" Uncle Jerry smirked. "What's her name?" "Yeri, enough." Lupe reprimanded her husband. "You're embarrassing Jack now. Come on inside and eat your dinner." "Good night, Jack." Lupe then turned and led my uncle back inside their house. Well, I'm happy for you, kid. We'd love to meet her sometime, invite her over for dinner or something. Uncle Jerry said over his shoulder as he was pulled inside by his wife, the door closing behind him. I turned and walked up the stairwell. Christ, I thought I was going to have a heart attack a moment ago. I needed to lie down and calm myself. In my room I lay on the bed, contemplating how close the whole secret arrangement with Lupe had come to being discovered. Later I took a shower, went and got something to eat from a local restaurant, and brought it back to my room to eat. I was watching TV when there was a knock at the door. I looked up as the door opened and Lupe quietly stepped in, closing the door behind her. Jesus, that was close, I told Lupe, standing up. Relax, he was just joking. Lupe replied. Yeah, but I didn't know that, Lupe, I said, feeling a bit angry about the whole thing. I almost blurted out something. I didn't know what to say. I know, but I was there to make sure you didn't say anything you shouldn't, Lupe said calmly, but it was my fault I left my here. That's on me, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry too. I didn't notice it there either, I replied, sitting back down. Luckily, it was one of the ones I keep secret from him, I just wore it for you. So he didn't recognize it, Lupe explained. And so you told him I had a girlfriend? I asked. Exactly. I had to tell him something. Otherwise. Yeah, then he might suspect something was going on. You know. Lupe continued, so I told him you'd met some local girl, and it was probably hers. I see, I told her. So, now we need to find you a girlfriend, don't we? Lupe grinned. What? I asked, incredulous. Of course. We've told him you have a girlfriend now, Lupe continued. If he doesn't see you with some girl pretty soon, he's going to start getting suspicious. But I mumbled. If he doesn't see you with some girl, what is he going to think, Jack? Maybe he's going to think that I lied to him, Lupe explained, then he's going to wonder why I would lie about such a thing. And then maybe he's going to suspect about what has really been going on. I see, I replied. And I can't have that. Jack. I won't, Lupe said firmly, you know that. So, if you want to maintain our arrangement, then you have to help me fix this. She wasn't subtle. Lupe was threatening to end our arrangement. I didn't want that either. I was totally addicted. I nodded, agreeing in advance to whatever it was I knew that she was about to propose. So, you agree? We need to find you a girlfriend? Lupe asked again. I nodded. All right then. Tomorrow me and you are going out on the town. Yeri is away for the weekend doing some tractor maintenance work down the coast, Lupe explained. I'll take you to one of the local bars, they have a lot of young local girls there on a Friday night. Okay, I replied. So, I'll try to introduce you around, but then you're on your own. You'll have to use that young charm of yours to try and entice one of them, Lupe smiled. Just like that, huh? I said. It shouldn't be too difficult for you. You're young and handsome, and I'm betting these local girls will like a foreigner, Lupe told me. Well, I guess you got it all figured out, huh? I smiled. Yes, I do, Lupe grinned, and another thing, she's got to be slim, and just like Yeri said. Geez, anything else? I complained. I looked at her, slightly puzzled. If you home some skinny, Yeri's gonna know that wasn't hers, and get suspicious again, Lupe said, grinning again, so make sure you pick one. Okay. I shall do my best, I replied, standing up and moving closer to Lupe. I embraced her. What are you doing? Lupe asked. Well. All this talk of. I began. Please, you must be joking, Lupe grinned. Oh, come on, I told her. And another thing, until Yeri has seen you with your new girlfriend, Lupe replied, reaching for the door. But. What about our arrangement? I asked. Yes, well, Lupe said, thinking for a moment, well. But no until Yeri sees you with your girlfriend. Either that or I can refund your money, I suppose. I'll take, I said, smiling. I thought you might, Lupe laughed, opening the door, and exiting my room that I heard the click-clack of her high-heeled shoes as she walked down the first-floor veranda outside and back into her home with Uncle Jerry at the end of the building. I suppose it might be fun to meet some local girls, and for all this to happen pretty quickly that I sat outside my room on the veranda, drinking a Coke and enjoying the cool night air. But after a while, the quiet calm of the courtyard was interrupted. From the end of the building, I could just make out the sounds of Lupe that I had become so accustomed to. Looking down the length of the veranda, I could just about see into Lupe and Uncle Jerry's bedroom. Lupe had left the window shutters slightly ajar, a window open, and the light on. I wondered if Lupe had left the shutters open, and the light on deliberately. Was she sending me a message? Perhaps. I went to bed and did exactly as Lupe had instructed me earlier. The next day I awoke late. And just lazed about most of the day. In the late afternoon, I sat out on the veranda outside my room again. In the courtyard below I watched my uncle pack up his tools into the back of his truck. He was taking it on the ferry down to a town on the south of the Colombian Pacific coast, near the border with Ecuador, for some maintenance work on some farmers' tractors down there. Later Lupe appeared to say goodbye to her husband, hugging and kissing him, before he gave me a wave and drove off to the quayside to wait for the ferry. Lupe then disappeared back inside their home at the end of the building that I returned to my room and took a shower. I looked through my clothes in the wardrobe. I had to pick out something smart to wear for my night out with Lupe later. I was going to have to try and impress a local girl, just enough to get her number at the very least. There was then a knock at the door, which immediately opened, with Lupe coming into view. Lupe came in and closed the door behind her. I thought our session was tomorrow. I asked, curiously, that I had already had one of my 2 weekly sessions with Lupe on Monday morning after my uncle went off to work, and before I had headed out for the week on my photography assignments. Well, I've had to move it up a day, Lupe replied. That I sat on the side of the bed, as Lupe grabbed a cushion and threw it on the floor in front of me. I told you yesterday, until you get that girlfriend, Lupe smirked, so why are we doing this now and not tomorrow? I asked, although I certainly wasn't complaining. Well, we're going out later, right, to find you a girl? Lupe said, and I have been. Lupe giggled, looking up at me. It's just a temporary suspension of our agreement. And everything goes back to normal. I'll make it up to you for all that you've missed out on. Besides, your uncle becomes suspicious, it will be a permanent end to our fun, won't it? Lupe grinned up at me. Lupe had an arrangement with not only me but 2 other guests here, Mr. Cohen and Mr. Dubois. Plus, in the last week of each month, Lupe switched to service Izzy's guests at Casa Rosita Guesthouse across town. Whilst Izzy came here to service Lupe's guests, just to keep things interesting for everyone involved. Izzy had at least 2 long-term guests. That's right. So take one for the team, get a girlfriend, and make this all go away, Lupe chuckled. You'll not only improve your own situation but ensure all those other men get to continue to me too. I'm sure if they could, they would all thank you from the bottom of their hearts, Jack. We both laughed. My job was done, as was hers. She then got up off feel good? She asked. I nodded, smiling, closing my eyes for a moment. Now your mind is clear, you know what you've got to do tonight, don't you? Lupe asked. Come on then, take a shower and get ready. I'll come and get you in 30 minutes. With that, she turned and opened the door, and stepped out onto the veranda outside, and I heard the distinctive click-clack of her high heels as she returned to the end of the guesthouse building. That I had a micro nap for a moment, then got up and took a shower again. I then dressed in my best-looking outfit right on time. Lupe knocked at my door. It was quite a conservative look for a night out on the town, but of course, this was not a date. Lupe was just escorting me to a local hangout so that I might meet someone. She certainly didn't want people to think we were on a date. She was a married woman, and this was a fairly small town. We could run into people she knew. Or people who knew Uncle Jerry. As my uncle had taken the truck, our only transportation option was the scooter. I drove, while Lupe sat behind. It was a short ride out to a secluded little square I had passed through before, but only during the day. Now it was evening, it looked rather different. Fairy lights were dangled across some trees and outside the 2 bars and 3 restaurants that were the main attraction here. Lupe instructed us to park the scooter in one corner of the square, and we headed over to a bar in the other corner. That we sat at the bar as no tables were available, and ordered drinks. Lupe nodded, smiling at me, looking around. The average age of people in this bar was young. Late teens to mid-20s mostly, a few people in their 30s too. Lupe was probably one of the older people in here. As we drank, I noticed a gaggle of girls over at a table not far from the bar. There were 8 of them, plus one guy, who by his rather camp mannerisms I guessed was their gay friend. There were quite a few attractive ones amongst them. Lupe caught me looking over at them and smiled. She said I should go over there and introduce myself, but I declined. I had no inspiration on how to strike up a conversation. Half an hour passed, and Lupe and I had another drink and continued chatting amongst ourselves. Suddenly I saw a few of the girls I had been checking out get up and move over to the pool table in the corner. This was my chance, and Lupe saw that too. She instantly stood up and made her way over to the pool table, and I followed. When one of the girls made a great shot, Lupe applauded her. The girl looked up and grinned. Lupe then spoke with her in Spanish for a moment. I caught a few words, but most of it passed me by as they spoke so quickly. Lupe then translated, telling me she had bet the girl that she and I could beat whoever won the current game. The girl had agreed apparently, and soon I was playing with Lupe against 2 of the girls. My pool skills were not great, and Lupe's much worse, so we lost. Lupe then chatted with one of the girls again and then turned to me. We lost the bet. You have to buy all these girls a drink, Lupe giggled. Huh? I asked, acting surprised. All the girls laughed, joking with each other. Lupe told them to call over the other girls from their table. I ordered drinks for everyone, and we all sat together at 2 tables that we pushed together next to the pool table. Lupe introduced me to the girls, telling them I was her nephew, visiting from London, England. This seemed to impress some of them, and they leaned in to hear what I had to say in my very poor Spanish, which I constantly apologized for. For the next few hours, Lupe and I sat there chatting with these girls. They were all local, from this town or the next town over. They were all in their late teens or early 20s. Some had jobs, others were students at a small community college. There were some rather pretty girls here, and I enjoyed chatting, joking, and flirting with them. They seemed interested in a young foreigner, as it seemed they didn't meet many very often. Some spoke a little English, whereas others little or none at all. Eventually, my conversations became confined to just 2 of these lovely young ladies. One was Valentina, a gorgeous-looking 19-year-old with long dark hair, a fit, slim body, and a killer smile. The other was her friend Milena, who was also very pretty indeed. Milena was 18, and had long dark hair too, but with blonde streaks. She too had a lovely smile and wonderful giggle. Valentina wore a short black pleated skirt with a pink vest top. Milena wore tight jeans shorts and a little white crop top. I continued chatting with both of them. They were both students at the local community college. Milena definitely spoke a lot more English than Valentina, who spoke almost none. As my Spanish was very limited, I spoke mostly with Milena, and she would sometimes translate for Valentina. At one point they both went to the ladies' room, leaving me at the table by myself. Lupe had moved to the bar, some of the other girls had left, and the remaining girls and their gay friend had begun playing pool again. Some older, slightly balding guy was attempting to chat up Lupe at the bar. But I could tell she wasn't interested at all. Lupe looked over to me just before Valentina and Milena returned. She gave me a thumbs up. Apparently, she approved of either of these 2 girls, as both of them had to make Uncle Jerry be convinced that the shirt he had found was theirs, and not his wife's. Valentina and Milena returned, and I bought them both another drink. I had to decide pretty soon if I was going to make a move on either of these girls, and if so, which one. The bar would be closing shortly, so I had to strike while the iron was hot that I was certainly very attracted to both of them, perhaps Valentina a little more if had to call it. There was just something about that smile of hers. Plus that amazing killer body. The problem was we couldn't communicate with each other. I didn't fancy my chances of taking Valentina out on a date, being able to entertain her enough that I might convince her to come back to my room, if we really couldn't talk to each other, therefore I decided to concentrate my efforts on Milena. She was also very pretty. As her English was adequate, I could see myself after a date or two, perhaps convincing her to come back to my room. As we chatted, I leaned in and whispered in her ear. I told her, in a mixture of English and Spanish, that she was beautiful, and that I would love to see her again, that I would love to take her out sometime. Milena giggled and blushed a little. Perhaps she was a little shy. Valentina spoke with Milena in Spanish. Valentina nodded as Milena discussed what I assumed I had just asked her. Valentina looked over at me, looking slightly disappointed. Had she wanted me to ask her out? But then she smiled, perhaps happy for her friend. Milena then turned back to me and said she would like to go out sometime, but that her parents forbade her from going out on a weekday, as she had her studies. I asked if she was free tomorrow night, which was Saturday night, and she replied that she was. As the bar now seemed to be closing, I quickly got Milena's phone number. Lupe and I split the bill, and then I said goodbye to Milena and Valentina. I told Milena I would call her tomorrow. Lupe and I left the bar and rode back to the guest house on the scooter. So, how did it go? Lupe asked, shouting above the noise of the scooter's engine. Well, I have a date for tomorrow, I replied. Which one? Lupe asked that. I told her it was with Milena and explained which girl that was. Really? Lupe said, sounding slightly surprised. Well, just make sure you seal the deal with her quickly. Perhaps Lupe thought Valentina was a better fit for me, but I didn't ask her about it. The next night I met Milena at a nice restaurant that Lupe had recommended. Milena wore slightly more conservative clothing this time, with a buttoned-up blue blouse and tight full-length jeans. She still looked good. We ate a nice dinner and chatted about many topics. She asked me all about London, and about my work here in Colombia. She told me about her family and all about what she wanted to do when she finished college. After dinner, we walked down to the coast and walked along the beach. It was very dark, and therefore quite private. I put my arm around her shoulder as we walked, which she seemed to like. That we stopped behind an outcropping of rocks, looking out over the dark ocean. I put my arms around Milena's waist, and she looked up at me and smiled. This was my chance. I leaned in and kissed her. Milena grinned, returning the kiss. But that image was suddenly broken as Milena broke off our embrace. She crossed her arms and looked rather upset. I apologized, but the mood had dramatically changed. I had misjudged the situation. I guess Lupe was right. Perhaps particularly to a girl like Milena, who seemed a little shy, and perhaps inexperienced. Milena started walking the opposite way back down the beach, back to where my scooter was parked. I walked alongside her, apologizing again, trying to make a joke, make her see the funny side. That we reached the scooter and Milena asked me to drive her home, which I did. Outside her house, she said goodbye and walked to her door. She then turned and came back to me on the scooter, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, then went inside her house and closed the door. I wondered what the kiss meant. I took it to mean that perhaps not all was forgiven, but at least she wasn't mad at me or anything. That I drove back to the guest house and crashed out on the bed, feeling rather frustrated. The next day, Sunday, I called Milena. I apologized again to her. She seemed a bit happier and said she had discussed with her friend Valentina what had occurred the night before. Milena told me she had decided that perhaps she wasn't quite ready for a relationship with someone like me, that she couldn't give me what I wanted from her. Well, she wasn't wrong there, I suppose. I didn't want to hurt Milena's feelings or make her feel used, so decided not to pursue her any further. I wished her luck, we said our goodbyes, and that was it. That it was a shame. Milena was a nice girl, and was just what I needed to convince my uncle about the shirt he had found. But it wasn't to be. Monday morning came, and I was supposed to head out for the week on my photography assignments. But I was in a bad mood, after what had happened recently, that I wished Lupe had come up with a different story when Uncle Jerry found shirt in my room. But of course, it could have been worse. He could have immediately accused Lupe and me. It had only been because of Lupe's quick wits that she came up with the lie about me having a local young girlfriend. But I had so far failed to produce a girl that would kill off any suspicions my uncle might have. I sat out on the veranda, and around lunchtime saw Lupe step out from her home at the end of the building. Lupe headed toward Mr. Dubois' room and knocked on the door. Just before the door opened, she looked across the courtyard at me and grinned, blowing me a kiss. Then the door opened, and Lupe stepped inside. Of course, I could sneak into the bathroom next door to his room and spy on them again, but Lupe had banned me from that activity too. That I felt frustrated, not knowing how to resolve the whole situation. Around 4 p.m. I was hungry. I headed out to a little restaurant about 5 minutes walk from the Casa Madre Guesthouse. Around 5 p.m. I returned to the Guesthouse. Uncle Jerry had apparently just returned a moment ago and was in the courtyard being greeted by his wife Lupe. My uncle then came and greeted me, and invited me in for a drink. I accepted, but then noticed Lupe shake her head. "Oh no. No drinking tonight, honey," Lupe said to her husband, "Jack, you should go to your room and get some rest." "Nonsense, woman. Let's all have a drink together." Uncle Jerry said. "No, Jack isn't feeling well. He needs to go to bed," Lupe said firmly, looking me sternly in the eye. "Don't you, Jack?" "Ah yeah, I guess you're right," I replied, unsure of what was going on. "Maybe another time, uncle." I headed up the stairwell. I had taken Lupe's hint that she didn't want me to come in for a drink and that I should return to my room. But why? I looked back at Lupe, and she grinned at me for a moment. Then turned and headed inside arm in arm with Uncle Jerry. What on earth was going on? Why had Lupe told Uncle Jerry I was sick? This was all very peculiar. That I reached my room, opened the door, and immediately realized what was going on. In front of me, in my bed, was Valentina. She was sitting up, leaning back against the headboard. She grinned at me, and grabbed the sheet, pulling it back. "Jack." "Valentina," she said in her terrible English, but I got the point. That I closed the door behind me, and Valentina smiled. She pointed at my clothes. I didn't need to be asked twice. Valentina grinned too. I wondered if when Milena had talked to Valentina the day before, she had told her I had done exactly this. And that was why she smiled. Was it a knowing smile? There was no way to know, however, as Valentina and I could barely communicate. Had Valentina convinced her friend Milena that I was no good, and not to be trusted, just so that she could come here? Again, I would probably be unable to find that out either. She smiled, said something in Spanish, and sat down on the side of the bed in front of me. She seemed pretty experienced for a 19-year-old girl. Of course, it couldn't compare to the incredible skills and experience of Lupe, or Izzy for that matter. Over the noise Valentina was making, I could just make out some other noises outside the room in the courtyard below. I could hear my uncle loudly dropping his toolbox and other items onto the metal flatbed of his truck. It suddenly gave me an idea. Quick as a flash, I sat up. She disappointment, sitting up and looking puzzled as I moved to the window. I pulled the curtain back and opened one of the windows, then another, before drawing the curtains again. I even went into the bathroom briefly to open a window in there too. Valentina looked at me quizzically as I returned to the bedroom. "Too hot," I told her, waving my hand in front of her face and puffing out my cheeks. She nodded, but still seemed puzzled as I returned. Of course, I had an ulterior motive for opening the windows. I thought of the circumstances of what must have happened before I arrived back at the guest house. Valentina must have spoken with Lupe. As it was obvious Lupe had wanted me to come straight up to my room because she knew Valentina was waiting here for me. Lupe also must have let her in the room, as I always locked the door whenever I left. I imagined Valentina had decided it wasn't going to work out with me and her friend Milena, so why shouldn't she get some nice young English instead? She must have at least hinted at this when speaking to Lupe, as Lupe seemed to know Valentina was up in my room. Perhaps Lupe had even suggested that Valentina should greet, as Lupe knew Valentina spoke almost no English, and it would make it immediately obvious to me as to why she was here that I had also figured that Lupe was probably listening outside somewhere and had now sent Uncle Jerry out to his truck for some chore or other. It was time to realize our plan. There's no way Uncle Jerry didn't hear that. Christ, they probably heard that out on the street. She looked a little shocked for a moment, then smiled and giggled, looking up at me, but without learning an awful lot of Spanish, I probably wasn't going to ever find that out. Eventually, Valentina went to shower and clean up. Valentina tapped her finger on her watch. Mama, she said that I assumed she meant she had a curfew time that she had to be home by, and it was approaching or had already passed. On the way out, I enacted the final part of Lupe's little plan. I took Valentina's arm, and took her downstairs, across the courtyard to the end of the guesthouse building where Lupe and Uncle Jerry lived. I knocked on the door and heard Lupe call me in. At the kitchen table were Lupe and my uncle, eating their evening meal. "Ah, here's the two lovers," Uncle Jerry remarked with a smile. I saw Lupe smile too. Our plan had worked. Uncle Jerry had obviously heard Valentina and me earlier. They invited us to sit with them, but Valentina shook her head at me, tapping her watch again. "Just 1 minute," I pleaded with her. I pulled out a chair for Valentina, inviting her to sit. As she moved to sit down, I took her jacket from her, putting it over the back of the seat. Now we could all see Valentina's wonderful figure. Most importantly, I noticed Uncle Jerry checking her out. Lupe noticed her husband's eyes. Lupe smiled at me. Our plan had worked. Any suspicions he may have had been killed off tonight. Lupe and I would just have to be even more careful in the future. Lupe and Valentina chatted in Spanish for a few minutes, whilst I chatted with my uncle. Then Valentina told Lupe she really needed to go. I said I would drive her home on the scooter. Valentina then asked Lupe if she could use the bathroom. I went out to the scooter and started it up. Lupe appeared and came out into the courtyard. I could hear Uncle Jerry clearing away plates in the kitchen. "Well done, Jack," Lupe whispered. "I hope she was fun." I nodded, rather sheepishly. "The whole courtyard could hear you two banging away." Lupe giggled. Jerry was very impressed. "Really?" I replied. "Yes." "Well, everything can go back to the way it was now, can't it?" Lupe grinned. "I certainly hope so," I told her. "Good boy," Lupe told me, "I've got something very, very special planned for you next week to thank you." "What is it?" I asked, intrigued, as Valentina reappeared and walked towards us. "You'll see," she replied. God, I couldn't wait to find out what she had in store for me. To be continued. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. No part of this story can be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means without written permission from the author. All characters are fictitious, and any similarity to actual people, living or dead, events, or locales is entirely coincidental unless otherwise stated. Dear friends, thank you very much for watching. Leave comments, put likes, share with friends and subscribe to the channel.